very much for the invitation to come and speak with you. And I was beginning to feel like maybe this was now for something quite different kind of presentation because my objective here is to lay out a little bit of the international public financing that is being made available to help support the objectives of achieving access to sustainable energy for all. And in particular, to look at the role of climate finance in this context, because there are obvious overlaps between the objectives of the Sustainable Energy for All initiative, particularly when you take into account the goals as articulated by the high-level Secretary General initiative, and climate change as a policy issue. So let me start by attempting to do a little bit of a map of the global climate finance architecture. And as you can see, it's rather a messy map. But this is what we do over at ODI, is we try and make sense of an increasingly complex landscape of public finance that is being made available to help developing countries respond to the challenges of climate change, and in that context, oftentimes also address issues related to access to sustainable energy. So what I've tried to lay out here are the fact that we have climate finance being delivered through a diversity of channels at present, including traditional bilateral development institutions, as well as a growing number of multilateral channels. And the number of funds perhaps belies sort of the scale of financing that's often available. So just because you see a lot of boxes on this chart doesn't necessarily mean that there's a lot of money flowing through all of the boxes on this chart. But as you can see, I've highlighted in yellow the funds that have a particular focus on mitigation, or rather on reducing emissions and on energy in particular. And I thought that what I would do is try and sort of take us through a little bit of the kinds of financing that have been made available over the past few years, and then go in from that to some broader reflections around the challenges of actually extending finance to programs that allow us to extend access to energy at scale. So the longest standing funds that we have here are, of course, the Global Environment Facility, which was established a long time ago now as a fund to help implement global environmental agreements. And over the last few years, we've seen a number of new dedicated climate funds be established. Notable amongst them are the climate investment funds, which are administered by the World Bank in partnership with other regional development banks, and were originally established to help the development banks do more to help developing countries address climate change. And I want to turn to those in a little more detail in a minute. But first, I did want to flag for us the most recent addition to the multilateral landscape of climate finance, which is the Global Green Climate Fund, which was established, well, it was agreed in principle in Cancun in 2010, and then in Durban last year, a governing instrument for the fund was actually adopted. And the board of the Global Green Climate Fund, which is intended over time to become the channel through which the majority of climate finance will flow, met for the first time a couple of weeks ago now in Geneva. A delayed meeting, postponed more than 3 times, I think, before it actually finally met. But what it is that the Green Climate Fund will offer to this sort of complex landscape of climate finance very much remains to be seen, because we remain at the early stages of deciding how it is that this fund will work. And as it gets through the task of agreeing on its work program, it potentially holds the possibility of filling some of the gaps in the current climate finance architecture, including in the context of trying to achieve low carbon development and access to energy kinds of goals. But we can come back to that perhaps in the discussion a little bit in terms of what are the gaps that the current public finance landscape needs to have filled, and the role that new institutions and bilateral institutions can play in that context. So let me focus then for a minute on the current finance that we have coming out of the climate space, particularly that addresses emissions from energy and energy and development objectives to some extent. And what we see quite clearly here is that the longest standing fund is no longer the largest fund, so $1.8 billion rather, through the Global Environment Facility, if you counted the last 2 cycles of replenishment of it, which compares sort of with the current commitment of financing to the Clean Technology Fund, which is administered by, as I said, the World Bank in partnership with regional development banks, which now has about $4.8 billion of financing committed to it. The second energy-relevant program within the climate investment funds is a smaller fund called the Scaling Renewable Energy Program, which was established as it became increasingly clear that in order to achieve the stated objectives of the Clean Technology Fund, which was to achieve large-scale emission reductions at the lowest possible cost in the immediate term, there was a real risk that issues around extending access to energy, particularly to the poorest and in poorest countries, would get sidelined. And it was in response to that recognition that there might need to be a different kind of approach taken to financing access-oriented solutions, particularly in lower-income countries, that the Scaling Renewable Energy Program was also introduced as a sub-fund of the climate investment funds. So while the Clean Technology Fund is by far the bigger fund, having $4.8 billion committed to it, the $417 million Scaling Renewable Energy Fund is a fund that works in pilot programs, trying to experiment ways to scale up access solutions that particularly involve renewable energy technologies. And I think it's worth sort of taking a minute maybe to reflect a little bit on the kinds of projects and programs that have been financed by these two initiatives, because they are sort of bigger funds that have been established more recently than, for example, the Global Environment Facility. And I think they tend to be a little bit less well understood in terms of what it is that they've ended up having to support and the kinds of trade-offs that they've had to encounter as they get from concept to execution. So as I say, the Clean Technology Fund has ended up largely focusing on middle-income countries and largely looking at large-scale options that can deliver GHG emission reductions at scale. And because of the beginnings of the fund, in that it was supposed to build on the existing programming of the implementing entities in a set of pilot countries, it has been programmed on a first-come, first-served basis in response to investment plans that were developed by countries that sought access to finance. So for example, the first 3 countries to have investment plans approved by the Clean Technology Fund were Mexico, Turkey, and Egypt, countries where the World Bank in particular had long-standing programs underway looking at electricity reform. And they allowed the bank, or on climate change structural adjustment lending in the case of Mexico, and they allowed the bank to build in new components that would scale up the aspects of it that looked at greenhouse gas emission reductions. And then over time, you've seen, there was a quick move for all of that funding to be programmed because there was a lot of pressure on this fund to demonstrate results quickly. So you had 12 investment plans approved in the course of about a year, one of which includes a concentrating solar thermal power program in the Middle East and North Africa, which is intended to work in 5 countries to deliver regional level concentrating solar thermal power program, basically. And that program is now underway only in Morocco, actually, because political uncertainties have made it quite difficult to take programming forward in some of the other countries. The Scaling Renewable Energy Program takes a rather different approach. It was a much smaller pot of money, particularly at the outset, and so an expert group was appointed to help identify a set of countries where it would make sense to undertake pilot programs in the immediate term. So where CTF programs are hundreds of millions of dollars in scale, and tend to be on-grid power projects, renewable energy projects, energy efficiency projects, or bus rapid transit and sustainable transport projects. That's basically the entirety of the Clean Technology Fund portfolio. The Scaling Renewable Energy Program looks a little bit different. So it's 6 pilot countries, mostly low-income countries. A strong focus on electricity and power-related solutions, but also a few projects, particularly on Honduras, that are looking at cook stoves and cooking-related solutions. But we do generally tend to see a focus on electricity over other forms of energy solutions. And I'm not sure that the effort to spend large volumes of finance quickly necessarily sort of creates the incentives that allow people to look beyond those kinds of solutions. But that's something maybe we can sort of come back to a bit more in the discussion. I just wanted to quickly run us through some of the new commitments for financing that have emerged post-Rio in the context of the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. And this is by no means a comprehensive listing of the financing that's been mobilized, but it's a little bit of a look at the new commitments that have been announced by the SE for All initiative. And these include an OPEC fund for international development efforts to finance energy for the poor, Bank of America's commitment to mobilize $50 billion of environmental lending by 2015, and they expect that based on the current appropriations of that financing, up to $35 billion of that finance will likely go towards renewable energy and sustainable energy for all type of programming. A European Commission initiative to set up an energizing development initiative, which will primarily, as I understand it, involve setting up a technical assistance facility that brings best available EU expertise to help developing countries work through access to sustainable energy solutions with a goal of reaching 500 million people. And the MDBs have pledged more than $30 billion in support of the overarching objectives of sustainable energy for all, largely, and committed to scaling this up largely by leveraging in increased private investment. And I think it's worth noting that a lot of the MDB commitment in this space also reflects their ongoing commitments to scale up investment in climate change and low carbon development solutions. So things like their contributions to the climate investment funds count as part of this pledge of scaled up commitment. Similarly, the US had made a commitment of the Overseas Private Import Corporation making $2 billion of financing available for renewable energy technologies consistent with SE for All objectives. But again, that lending line is part of the US's far-start finance commitments under the Climate Change Convention, and it actually responds to a cap on OPEC's emissions that was adopted by the corporation in response to litigation about the climate change impacts of its fossil fuel lending in the past. So I think there's a lot going on here, but when we actually begin to look at how much of this effort is necessarily new, it's not necessarily quite so encouraging, and it's clear that there is a very big overlap between the new funding commitments that have been announced in the context of SE for All and the efforts to mobilize financing for climate change. And I think the underlying context for all of this that we cannot fail to keep in mind is that of fiscal austerity. We are talking about asking governments, developed country governments who find themselves in quite difficult financial circumstances on a variety of fronts to mobilize new finance for an agenda that politically ends up being very difficult, particularly for more so for some countries than others, but certainly for everybody. Mobilizing new money for these sorts of agendas is no easy task at this moment. And I think that's part of what explains some of the dynamics that we see emerging in terms of how it is that these scarce public resources end up getting programmed in practice. There is a strong pressure to try and claim multiple credit for different pots of money, given that it is very difficult to, at this point, really draw in new forms of money. I think the other dynamic that we see emerging here is that intermediaries are seeking to spend, sorry, I'm not sure what happened there, are seeking to spend large amounts of finance quickly, as I said. So there's a lot of pressure for money to be spent quickly and for results to be shown quickly. And we're working within, most of the programs that I've described here work through existing financial institutions who tend to do better with larger scale interventions that have lower transaction costs rather than doing smaller scale kinds of projects. And this then manifests itself in the kinds of portfolios that we see being supported by some of these larger funds in particular. This pressure to spend large amounts of finance quickly results in larger scale solutions tending to be preferenced over smaller scale solutions like the ones that my colleagues have described previously in this session, which require a lot more individualized attention, much smaller scale kinds of projects, right? And in a way, this is an interesting thing that comes out when you compare the Scaling Renewable Energy Program with the Clean Technology Fund Program. It's a smaller sum of money that's entrusted to the Scaling Renewable Energy Program, but perhaps that fact that it's a smaller sum of money lends itself to doing these smaller kinds of transactions as well, and that's built into the approach of this REP, as opposed to the Clean Technology Fund, which has really been designed to try and do big things as quickly as we can. That doesn't mean to say, however, that just trying to do things as quickly as you can means that you can overlook underlying regulatory and governance impediments to actually doing large things at scale well. The other thing I observe is that there tends to be a scarcity of public finance, at least in the current global climate finance architecture, for innovation. And I think this is compounded to some extent by the fact that a lot of the finance that is being made available comes out of development assistance budgets and is required to demonstrate progress on achieving development goals in a very tangible way, again in a context in which those who are mobilizing the finance are under an awful lot of pressure to show that they spent this money well, and where the tolerance for failure is actually very, very low, particularly on the part of developed country taxpayers. Now, this results in a situation in which there tends to actually be quite low appetite for risks of a diversity of natures. Low appetite for risk in terms of reaching lower income households and communities, but also lower appetite for risk in terms of the kinds of technologies that we choose to invest in and the place on the technology innovation scale for which public finance is actually available. So the Clean Technology Fund, for example, does not fund innovation stage technologies at all. In fact, the closest thing to an innovation stage technology that it does fund is concentrating solar thermal power. In part because of this need to demonstrate deployment results at scale, but also because of a genuine reluctance, I think, on the part of developing country governments to accept loans for programs that would potentially sort of put a little bit too much risk on their own systems. And so as a result, we have in the current financial architecture, I think, a little bit of neglect for that space in terms of innovation and in terms of research and development and in terms of tailoring technologies to fit local context, all of the things that my colleagues on our preceding panel emphasize as being so important, but things that it's actually currently quite difficult for the existing public financial architecture to invest in. I think that's something that's sort of interesting and a question, I suppose, in terms of where a niche that the Global Green Climate Fund could potentially fill is that a space where it might have some value to add, or are there other ways in which we can begin to come up with the kind of support that we need for that earlier stage kind of experimentation? We see a very strong interest in mobilizing the private sector and leveraging private investment, and I think there are lots of reasons for that, and it's important not to conflate those reasons. So one set of reasons is, of course, because we need to fundamentally shift the incentives of the private sector if we are going to succeed in achieving low carbon development trajectories. And that is something I don't think anybody in this room would disagree with, is that we need to change incentives so that low carbon development is business as usual development over time. But I think there is another aspect of, and that involves bringing in private actors of all shapes and sizes and getting them to do different things. But I think there is also another issue here around which is related to fiscal austerity and the difficulty of actually mobilizing large amounts of public finance and the need to be, and the desire to see private finance come in where public finance is more difficult to mobilize, and but that shouldn't lead us to necessarily expect that private finance can play all of the roles that public finance can play in every circumstance. And certainly when we're talking about interventions in the energy sector in developing countries, where a lot of times it does continue to be public utilities who are involved in a lot of the business operations that need to change, we do need to be thinking about different forms of public capital, including at domestic level, that can be brought in as part of the solution. I guess the last observation that I have is a lot of this comes down, and there's an increasing recognition of the importance of the underlying enabling environment, but rather I think, that's the term that we often use, but I think perhaps institutional reform and the policy frameworks that allow us to actually deploy these technologies at scale in a sustainable way. There's recognition that that needs more support, but historically we actually haven't seen that being supported in a very systematic way. And I think part of the challenge is monetary, in that we have tended not to have finance available for institutional reform, capacity building, and technical assistance in the ways that matter at developing country level. But I think the other part of this is that a lot of institutional reform and policy change is extremely complex and difficult issues that are related to very complex national politics. And reform isn't necessarily something that you can buy. Reform is a really difficult process of stakeholder engagement that requires a lot of nuance and complexity and creativity a lot of times, and sustained engagement. And perhaps, I guess, there's a question about whether we're trying to buy too much with what are ultimately very modest amounts of resources. We shouldn't be able to expect to buy economic transformation with the modest sums of resources that we've bought. But if we can use that money well in ways that empower stakeholders who are seeking change, or at least be cognizant of the broader political and institutional context within these bigger scale interventions that we're trying to finance fit, then perhaps that gets us a little bit closer to the ultimate goal, which is transformation. And I suppose, let me just conclude then by saying that I think part of this comes down to an issue around sort of the scale at which we're trying to spend money and the nature of the transactions through which we try and spend this money, and needing to be a little bit perhaps more realistic about what we can get if the pressure is to only spend large amounts very, very quickly, and be cognizant of the incentives of the people within the intermediary institutions that we're trying to work through in terms of them needing to prove success only by moving large amounts of money rather than necessarily sort of having the incentives to focus equally on outcomes. So it becomes a question of internal institutional incentives in terms of the institutions who are entrusted with the money as well. So let me end with that.
Thank you very much.